Thanks for coming back. This is part 2 of talk on the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. If you didn't watch part 1, you may want to go back and do that, and then come and join us here on part 2. For those of you who are continuing to watch from part 1, thanks. Thanks for sticking with me and making the jump over here. So, one of the points I wanted to make as we unpack this story that Jesus told his followers is that the master in the story and the third servant, they're not bad people. The master was actually quite generous. He gave a valuable coin to the servant that he thought didn't have a lot of ability. In some translations, that was called a talent. A talent, or this valuable coin, was thought to be worth about 15 years of wages. So if my boss wants to tell me, you seem like a pretty average employee, here's 15 years of wages for you. I'll take it, boss. Thank you. There was generosity. And when the two servants came back to him who had doubled their money, he didn't say, great, give me the money, give me the profits, get out of here. He said, I'm going to put you in charge of more. Come in and celebrate with me. He was not a bad guy. The third servant also was not a bad person, and I think he often gets mischaracterized really unfairly as some kind of, undesirable waste of space that we should try really hard to not be like him. And I want to point out he wasn't a bad guy. He kept the master's money safe. He didn't squander it. He didn't embezzle it. When the time came for him to settle accounts, he gave it back. So he wasn't a bad person. The master was not a bad person. And when we get into some of the language where one is saying, I know that you're harsh and hard, and another is saying, I think that you're evil and lazy, we have to remember that there was hyperbole in these stories. Because these people were not bad people, and we need to look at their inner character and figure out, again, how does that play into this larger story that Jesus is telling us? What is the point he wants to make? Another thing I want to do is to compare and contrast the first and second servant with the third servant. The first and second servants understood their master to be generous. They were willing to take risks with what he gave them because they trusted his character. And when we invest, we can just as easily lose what we invested as we can double it. And so they knew something about their master. They had seen something in him that made them feel emboldened to take a risk and trust that if they messed up and they lost all that money, that the master would be generous to them. Now, the third servant had a really different understanding of who the master was. The third servant called him harsh and hard. The third servant was afraid. He was too afraid to take a risk. He either didn't know the master well enough or wasn't able to trust the master well enough to take a greater risk. The most he felt he could do was just to bury it, rather than try and grow. Why? Why did he have a different view? I don't know. I'm thinking maybe there was something that happened to him that he caused him to be wary and suspicious and afraid. But I want to say, I have a feeling that some of us today can identify with that third guy. If we see that this story is perhaps telling us something about God, who is represented in the story as the master, and we see these servants as representing people, I have a feeling that some of us can identify with this third guy who was too wary and too suspicious and too afraid to invest more, to give more of himself and to try and grow. And this is a rhetorical question for you. Where do you think that comes from? If you can identify with that third person, where does that come from for you? For each of us, it's a little different. But a lot of us have something that makes us wary and guarded and suspicious. And I don't always know where that comes from. I was talking with a friend the other day who really was able to identify with this guy. We weren't talking about this story, but we were talking about God's wrath and judgment, and how my friend grew up hearing that message predominantly about who God was or who God is. And my friend said that in their tradition that they were raised in, they said God's love was really underrepresented. My friend said, I knew I was the bad kind of different from 3rd grade on. And so with my LGBTQ lens, I think that because I believed that the talk about judgment was directed right at me, that was my predominant takeaway. And so we've heard stories of Jesus, this story or stories like it. And some of us have felt, for whatever reason, judged by them. And if we take those to heart and we believe those deep down, of course we're not going to be able to trust God. Instead, we go and we bury the best bits of ourselves. And our potential to grow is squandered because we're afraid. We're suspicious, we're wary, we're guarded. Well, the first 2 servants had a really different understanding of the master than the 3rd servant. And so their stories ended differently. They were polar opposites. Do you think maybe when I say polar opposites, extreme, maybe here's some hyperbole? The first and second were good and faithful. They were called good and faithful by the master. The third was called evil and lazy. Polar opposites, maybe hyperbole. The first 2 were put in charge of more. The third one had his taken away. Polar opposites, very possibly hyperbole. The first 2 were invited to celebrate. The third was thrown out into the darkness where there were people crying and grinding their teeth. Polar opposites, perhaps hyperbole, and not to be taken literally. So should we take from this story that God throws out the people who are afraid of God? Absolutely not. That's absurd when we know of God as being one who lovingly reaches out to creation from the very beginning and finds way after way after way after way to make peace and to be reconciled with us. N.T. Wright, a scholar, he said this parable and others like it do not give a complete picture of the Creator God, the maker and lover of the world, the God who sent Jesus as a personal expression of divine love. God doesn't punish people who say, God, I don't know who you are enough to trust you more. I don't know that generous side of you. All I was told was about your anger and your wrath and your judgment. God doesn't punish people for being afraid. But if we stay hidden, there's no opportunity for growth. There's no opportunity to flourish and to become the person that we were created to be with our quirks and our strengths and our gifts. We are valuable to God. We are valuable. We have something to give. We have something valuable to give. And when we allow ourselves to trust God enough, even if it's this much, to help us grow it, then bit by bit, we will begin to transform and become the best version of ourselves. And unless we agree to participate in that, we remain to a degree in the darkness. Not out of punishment, but just as a natural outpouring of a decision that we've made. So what do? We may feel somewhat compelled and intrigued by this, and yet at the same time, super, super afraid. Everything reminds me of Schitt's Creek right now, because I love that show. It reminds me of the first episode, and Alexis is talking about this guy, her boyfriend, who's really faithless and uncommitted, and she's doing her best to hang on to this relationship and be hopeful. And she says to her brother about this boyfriend, she says, he told me that he could potentially see himself considering saying I love you at some point, sometime soon. And I wonder if some of us can identify with Alexis. God, maybe I could at some point potentially think about considering taking another little tiny step. if that's what you're saying, let me ask you, what do you need? Do you need time to reflect? You may be wanting to reflect on this talk for a long time and not do anything with it because you're unsure, and that's okay. Do you need to unpack some of the unhealthy aspects of faith that were handed to you and sift through it and decide, what am I going to throw out that I think is inconsistent with the character of God? And what is worth hanging on to? Do you need to just put all your cards on the table and say, listen, God, I'm really angry. I've been really hurt. I've been harmed. I've been abused. I've been traumatized. And I don't know what you want to do with that. But I got nothing. So if you want to do something, just, you're going to have to show me. If that's what you need to do, do it. If that's what you need to say it. The parish is a great place to do that. We are all people on that journey somewhere along the way. But only you can decide what comes next. Here's what I want you to know. When we choose to engage with God, even if it's just a rage and complain, God will lovingly engage with us. Jesus gave this invitation to his followers in Matthew chapter 11. He said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Keep company with me. Learn from me. I'm gentle and I'm humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul." God, we want to know you more, and yet some of us are so afraid. We're not even sure we want to know you more. We are just maybe dipping our toe in that pond, and we don't know how far we want to go or are willing to go. Would you show us this week? Would you show us in the days ahead who you are? Show us your presence, your generosity, and your love. We wait guardedly. We're afraid. We're suspicious, but we are going to try our best to listen and look for you in the everyday things of life. Let me offer you this blessing. The Apostle Paul offered this to the church in Ephesus. He said, "I ask God to strengthen you in your inner selves from the riches of God's glory through the Spirit. I ask that Christ will live in your hearts through faith as a result of having strong roots in love. I ask that you'll have the power to grasp love's length, height, depth, and width. I ask that you'll know the love of Christ that is beyond knowledge, so that you will be filled entirely with the fullness of God." Be filled. Grace and peace.